Welcome to Jay's Analysis, and we're going to do a follow-up to the debate with Nick Fuentes. It was a lot of fun. It went well. Thank you to everybody who watched it. It's only been up a couple days, and I think we've had 6,000. So that's probably a gold post. It's gold. It's going to keep getting hits forever and ever until YouTube deletes me as a person. Let's hope they don't do that. And I said that I would make a follow-up video to cover some of the points. Now, this is a follow-up video for people who are interested. I got so many questions, so many emails, so many messages. It's very difficult to respond, and I try. But see, what happens is that when you start responding to every single message, that you end up like your whole day will be responding to people asking you questions. And I don't mind it. I'm not saying don't ask me questions. I'm just saying that you have to understand that we've got, 20,000 on YouTube. We've got 10,000 on the different Facebook profiles, 10,000 at Soul of the East. We've got 4,000 or so on Twitter. I've also got the private subscriber list, which is separate from all that. I'm not saying how many that is, but I have, 40, 50,000 people that I'm having to respond to. Not literally, but that's the size of the audience at this time. And I think that in this next year, it's going to grow. I mean, we went from on YouTube 3,000 or 4,000 a year ago to 20,000. So in 1 year, we went from 3 to 20. So that's magnitudes of growth. And as the audience gets larger, it's magnitudes and magnitudes, it's exponential. So with Nick, what I want to do is cover some of the main points that he didn't get. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple books that I recommend that are good for people in the audience that are readable. Okay. We're not going to go into Ab Gatay's giant 500-page book on, every single papal quote or the Two Bodies of the Kings, another famous book that deals with some of this stuff. Those are too abstract and too academic for the average reader. There is a great book that is middle way, that bridges the gap between the academic and what's readable. And so we will talk about that book because it does discuss some of the points that I made. I didn't rely totally on this book. I'm just looking for a book. I mean, this is something I put a lot of time into. You can't boil it all down into one book. But, when you debate a Roman Catholic, you don't ever debate the theology. It's always just the papacy. That's the only thing they ever want to debate. And they all want to talk about marriage and divorce. Now, again, you can read the works of St. Basil, and Basil will talk about the Eastern canons and divorce and remarriage. Okay, so this is not that difficult. I get that question all the time. Go read that. Let's talk about the debate with Nick. So the first point that Nick didn't get was the differences in our views of God. We approach God as He, right? The Father. That's that's our God, is God the Father. And this is brought up when you read the Church Fathers. When you read Basil, for example, he speaks of God as He, as personal. When you read Plotinus speaks of God as an it, as being, as substance and essence, first and foremost. So these two rival conceptions, the Hellenic conception, the patristic, based in the Hebrew revelation conception, right? What Paul teaches in Acts, right? What does Paul do when he goes in Acts? When he talks to the Greeks in Acts 17, he does cite Greek philosophy to try to have a common ground and conversational discussion with his opponents at Mars Hill. When he recites the history of the people in the synagogues, when he's arguing and debating with Jews, he cites the law and the prophets. Obviously, he's going to what the different audiences are going to find authoritative and useful. So in the debate with Nick, what I wanted to do was originally kind of go into that, but I don't think he was ready for that. And that's fine. He wanted to discuss more of the papal stuff and the history of the church. So that's what the whole debate ended up being. I was really hoping it wouldn't be only that topic, but that's okay. Once you get a little more mature in these questions, is when you start to realize that there is a difference, a difficulty, what's sometimes called the Origenist problematic. And so what Origen did was he took the Greek Platonic, the Hellenic conception of simplicity, and he married it to the biblical conception of who God is. Right? And so this becomes normative, and then you have Aquinas and Augustine, and then Aquinas sort of continue this tradition of, when we talk about one God and divine simplicity, it is the Hellenic conception of the monad and God as an it. Then later we can tack on personhood, the different conciliar teachings about who God is. That is not the way that the East approaches it. So when you read St. Basil's epistles, when you read the different early fathers talking about the logoi, when you read the Cappadocians, when they talk about the energies of God, when you read St. John of Damascus talking about the energies of God, this is always the uncreated energies of God. Okay, so you can go listen to the Athanasius talks that I did a couple weeks ago where we go into that. I'm not going to rehash that stuff, but this is very important because it's very distinct from, and this is why when you talk to Roman Catholics, they don't know what you're talking about when you mention uncreated grace. They're confused when you start talking about divine simplicity, and they just rehash Thomas Aquinas. And they don't grasp, after a while they do, they don't grasp that when you talk about God, if you discuss any predicate of God in both Thomism and in normative dogmatic Roman Catholic theology, just read the Catholic Encyclopedia's article on divine simplicity. And it will say that no predicates of God are real. They're not real distinctions that match up to God really being distinct in these different ways. They are only notional. They're logical, human, social construct distinctions. They're not real distinctions in God. That's the essence of our problem. So for us, everything in Roman Catholicism that we disagree with flows out of that starting point, that Hellenic starting point. And it is. That's what it is. It's the Origenist problematic. Everything flows out of that, as opposed to a completely different conception then of God, of God's relationship to the world, of anthropology, human anthropology, of what salvation means, what uncreated grace is, of how the church, ecclesiology, how that works. And the eschatology is very different, okay? So we believe in a recapitulation and a cosmic renovation. When Christ became incarnate, it affected all, not just of human nature, but also all created nature. All of this is lost. And then, of course, we don't believe in the beatific vision. You don't see the essence of God. That's blasphemous. So all of this is two different treks that East and West go down. Now, when I was in my 20s, like Nick, when I converted to Roman Catholicism out of Calvinist Protestantism when I was 22, I'd not read any of these Eastern Fathers. I didn't know this kind of stuff. I didn't ask these kinds of questions. I had friends online who came along and did ask these questions, thank God. And of course, obviously, I was initially very defensive of my position. I wanted to remain, Catholic. I was very, very impressed with the lattice work of Catholicism and how it seemed to really all make sense and hold together. And then you, after a while, come to grips with the harsh reality of the Catholic world, which is that it's not holding together, and you have to deal with Vatican II. And then when you read Vatican II, and then when you read the theologians of Vatican II, it really becomes crystal clear. And so that's why I recommended certain books at the end of the debate, that like The Popes Against the Modern Errors, because after a while you start to realize that the modern Roman Catholic Novus Ordo Church does not believe what is contained in the papal encyclicals condemning all the heresies of modernism, right? And there's a million different ways that Roman Catholics can try to justify this, but it just doesn't work. And I tried all those ways. I tried it for 10 years. So what we have, I think, in Orthodoxy is really the medicine for all of this. The medicine for the sickness of religion of Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. I'm not just focusing on Roman Catholics. And we can see this. The reason, first of all, in terms of the discussion with Nick. The reason that I didn't immediately go into addressing each of the papal quotes, which he, I guess, had open several tabs from Catholic Answers. I mean, I know what's at Catholic Answers. I've read Catholic Answers before. I used to go to Catholic Answers when I was 22. I'm just making a joke here, so don't anybody be offended here. But I could tell where those quotes were coming from. The reason that I didn't go into each single quote is not because I don't have an answer to them. I do. I used to use those quotes. But for the sake of the audience, and because I've had this debate so many times, I've done hundreds of debates, I didn't want to get bogged down in an area where I know we're going to be going in circles about the meaning of Petra, Petros, the meaning of why Pope so-and-so said XYZ about the East or whatever. In other words, just because a Pope said something about universal jurisdiction doesn't mean it's true. Okay, so because the Popes thought at some point, down the line into the later centuries that they had universal, that doesn't mean that they had universal jurisdiction. Just because they excommunicated somebody far away, that doesn't mean that they had it, or that it was de facto given to them from Jesus to Peter, and so forth and so on. And the fact that St. Gregory, the dialogist, Pope St. Gregory, says the very opposite of all that is obvious. They didn't believe that. There might have been certain people who did think that, who thought, you know what, I occupy a bishopric that is so important that I have to take on the weight of saving the world from whatever heresy. It doesn't mean that it's true. So in other words, you can't just go to a quote from a pope in 700, 800, 900 and think that, or even 200 or 300, and think that that therefore proves papal supremacy. And you say, well, but people would have rejected it. People did reject it. That's what I'm sitting here telling you. When you read the letters of Pope St. Gregory, he calls it a spirit of Antichrist to think that there's a universal jurisdiction by one pope or one bishop. I mean, it's not that hard. And it's not accidental that the loss of Paedo Communion, the loss of of icons, the loss of a lot of things, it all came at the time of the introduction of the Filioque and the rise of the Carolinians. Right? This is the Frankish dynasty. So even if the totality of the Frankish thesis is not necessarily true, I'm not saying it is or it isn't. I'm saying that even if the totality of that thesis is not correct, it's still objectively true and verifiable and provable that around 800, 900, 1000 is when there's the changes in the West. The West used to practice Paedo Communion. Did you know that? Now, why is this a big deal? Well, first of all, what this does is when you don't allow infants to have communion, for example, is that this places them in this kind of lesser status, and that you start getting this introduction into the Latin West of the papal idea of these different grades of what it is to be a Christian. There's the super bishop in Rome. There's the cardinals and the curia of Rome. There's the regular bishops, and then there's the priests, and then the lowly laymen. Right now, I'm not saying that hierarchy is false. Orthodoxy believes in hierarchy. What I'm saying is that there is this introduction of this arbitrariness about what it is to be a Christian. You either are or you're not. Right? There's not like a half Christian. There's not a 75% Christian, and this is why in Roman Catholic monastic circles, there's all these different grades and levels and types, and that's why in Orthodox you only have one. You're either a monk and you do the Basilian, the order. We don't have Order of St. Basil, and there's just monks. That's it. There's not third degree removed Carmelite who just sits and stares at something all day. There's not a bunch of different levels and grades, and it's not like that because Jesus didn't set up a church that was this international bureaucracy. I mean, how could anybody who has the most basic familiarity with the book of Acts and with the church in the first 3, 4, 5, 6, 700 years, 800 years, it's not a giant international geopolitical bureaucracy. It comes to affect the political sphere, absolutely. And so, for example, as I've mentioned in many discussions and talks, Justinian, the Code of Justinian. By the time of the Emperor Justinian, the theology has affected the temporal sphere, and the emperors begin to defend orthodoxy. When Justinian begins his code, I just want to, just out of humor here, let's contrast this with the Declaration of Independence and the American Constitution and all this stuff. Justinian begins his discussion by giving praise to the Lord Jesus Christ. In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ is how it begins. See it here? The proemium. And then it goes on to list the laws and codes that are affected by this time by Christian theology and principles. And so then, from then on, as the emperors adopted Orthodox theology, you have the affirmation at the ecumenical councils of the God-ordained emperors. Now, that is, in a way, a dual principle of a kind of temporal power of the monarch and a spiritual power of the bishops and the ecumenical councils. But it's not what develops in the Latin West when you get to Unum Sanctum, which I'm going to read out of Denzinger. This is the Sources of Catholic Dogma. And this is page 186, 187, where the famous bull argues that all princes and bishops and every human creature universally must be subject to the Roman pontiff to achieve eternal salvation. So here you have in the West the complete dominance of the Frankish power by this time. Okay. This is why there's an Avignon papacy for a while, and there's three rival pope claimants in their palaces claiming to be pope. There ain't no way to get from Jesus talking to Peter to three different dudes in France in giant palaces claiming to be the successor to Peter. That is crazy land. And why would Jesus mandate that you have to submit to that? That's crazy. Again, I'm not saying that Christianity doesn't affect the whole world, that it doesn't eventually become a universal kingdom. It does, but becoming a universal kingdom does not mean that you leave or you ever fly out of and become this meta empire above what it is to be a Greek, what it is to be a nation, an ethnos. None of that is ever destroyed, but it's, I would say, inherent in the nature of Roman Catholicism itself to actually destroy these things because it is a giant international bureaucracy. The only other possible church to rival the claims, right, for one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church is Orthodoxy. So you've only got two options here for one holy Catholic and Apostolic throughout history. And it's either Rome or it's Orthodoxy. Now the Roman claim here in the dogma, and this is what Nick and many of the Roman Catholics don't actually know, that this is the dogma. You have to follow these things if you're a Roman Catholic. Like you don't get to set these aside. Everything in here is dogma for Roman Catholics, whether they know it or not, and whether the modern popes are honest about it or not. And as you can see in Unum Sanctum, you have to, everybody, the whole universe has to be subject to the Roman pontiff to be saved at all. That's crazy land. Who in their right mind would accept that? Does Peter operate like Unum Sanctum in the New Testament or in that book of Acts? No. Read Acts 15 and look at Peter's interaction at the synod, which is conciliarism. It's not Unum Sanctum. Peter doesn't stand up and say, brothers, God ordained that at my mouth the entire universe is subject to me to be saved. No one can achieve salvation outside of being subject to me, Peter. No, you don't get anything like that. So by the time of Vatican I, how is this kind of stuff justified? Because of these kinds of arguments. Well, you have these guys who come up with a creative theory, and they're actually the proto-liberals. They're actually the proto-modernists, believe it or not. If you doubt me on that, you can research that. Cardinal Newman proposed the idea of doctrinal development. And doctrinal development was crucial to explaining how there's all these difficulties in the early centuries of the church and in the New Testament, as opposed to giant palaces of 3 different guys in France and in Rome claiming to be the successor to Peter. And then eventually it's like, well, how do we get from that to infallibility? And the justification in the theology after this time period, post Cardinal Newman, is doctrinal development. Well, it just develops. It starts as a seed, and then it grows into a tree. The analogy in Daniel and in the New Testament is about the church as a seed growing and expanding its size. It's not about the doctrine going from a seed and then transforming into some wild, totally divorced from its original status and meaning bureaucracy. The Vatican Bank, run by the Rothschilds since the 1700s? Come on. Because I've had this debate, I didn't want to get bogged down in arguing over the context of a bunch of papal quotes that most of the audience is not going to be familiar with. They're not going to know what that is. A better way to approach this question is to just simply show that the Roman Catholic claims don't match up to previous praxis of the first millennium of the church. They don't match up to the praxis of the book of Acts. And so all Nick did was just keep going back to things that I addressed about 20 times and repeating them, and just repeat, and not listen to the explanation that I gave. And again, we don't want to get bogged down in this is because I did this for a time period. I got super bogged down in reading all of these different books, and I've read even the Russian guys who converted back to Catholicism. I've read Solovyov's book. I've read all these books. I have Peter and the Keys right here. I can get it. I can get this one. I can get all my Scott Hahn books out. I've read all Scott Hahn's books. I've read all of these books. I've read Dave Armstrong. I've read all the Catholic apologists. I know all this stuff. So what I'm getting at is that this question is not going to be solved by reading 10,000 pages of books. Nobody's going to do that in the audience anyway. What's an easier way to solve this question? Well, the Roman Catholic view is built like a house of cards. It's built on the claims of Petrine supremacy. And you notice that in the discussion with Nick. This is the other point. The Bible is what justifies the papacy. But the Bible is known by the claims of in the Roman Catholic view, of the papacy. You wouldn't have the Bible without the Pope. How do we know that the Pope is who the Pope is? Because it's justified in the Bible. Well, how do you know you're interpreting the Pope right? Well, because of classical foundationalism, and I just read things. Well, if you can just read things and interpret them right, why aren't you a Protestant? So there's a problem here, right? And that's actually because of Rome has the wrong anthropology. They don't have the nous. And against the Protestants, we do believe in a historic church, one holy Catholic apostolic church. The Protestants have lost the visible church because they're in schism. And so they don't understand that the church produced the canon. The church gave you the Bible. The church is the pillar and ground of truth, not written texts. The Protestants act like Talmudists, right? So they don't have the incarnate body, which is the church. So both Rome and Protestantism are in a dialectic between two false conclusions, which in Rome it's the analogia entis, it's the analogy of being, that we can find in created analogies between the essence of God and creatures, and the Pope will be the interpreter of all that. And in Protestantism, it's the dialectic of the many. It's 1,000 different sects, a new one every day, all arguing and competing. And again, let's let Ratzinger solve this for us. In Introduction to Christianity, he says for the first millennium of the church, they operated with conciliarism, collegiality, and not papal monarchy. Read Introduction to Christianity, and you'll see him say that. I've read 7 or 8 of Ratzinger's books, so I'm not making this up. They're all over here on this shelf right here. And once we understand that, okay, so yes, this has to have been some development. How did this development happen? Carolinians, the Franks. Photius discusses this. Patriarch Photius, by the way, who wrote the Mystagogy, refuting a lot of this nonsense that has to be repeated every generation. He actually mentions Franks being behind this. It's also mentioned at the 8th Eastern Council, which Pope John VIII signed the banning of the filioque. Nick totally just ignored that. It's one of the strongest arguments. In fact, I think Perloff mentions this as to one of the reasons why he converted, was that he realized, I think he says this, if I'm wrong, forgive me, but I think he says that, yes, that John VIII forbade the filioque being added to the creed. If people just understood that, then again, it becomes clear that this is all just gobbledygook. We don't have to do PhD thesis in history and church history and canon law, and we don't have to do all that because Roman Catholics admit John VIII signed this. And again, Dr. Carroll, Philip Blosser, all over the place mental gymnastics to explain this. The Sixth Council, in their mind, they had no problem condemning Pope Honorius. I'm not saying that Pope Honorius was in error. Again, a lot of those, I don't think Roman Catholics understand that many popes are saints in Orthodoxy. Pope Saint Leo, right? They don't understand this point. But our argument is that the mind of the church, the ecumenical church as a whole, which it can never happen that the entire church is wrong, right? The church is infallible, not one bishop in Rome. It can never happen that the whole church believes that they could condemn a pope and be wrong about that. It was obviously not their mindset that the Bishop of Rome is infallible and not liable to fall into theological error. What's unclear about that argument? And the Catholic apologists go all over again, mental gymnastics, going crazy, trying to show, well, actually, Pope Honorius wasn't really wrong because he was in agreement with Maximus the Confessor. I know that. Yes, the Sixth Council's arguments are all based on Maximus's debate with Pyrrhus. And when you read Maximus's debate with Pyrrhus, guess what the whole thing hinges on? The Eastern view of the Trinity, uncreated grace, and the essence-energy distinction. That's why the Pope's letter at the Sixth Council against monothelitism defends the essence-energy distinction. 2 operations, 2 natural wills, 2 natural energeia operations, 2 natural wills in Christ. That's the essence-energy distinction. That argumentation is based on St. Maximus's debate with Pyrrhus. It's a very small book. It's 100 pages. Get it off of Amazon. Read the debate with Pyrrhus. It's all about the essence-energy distinction in Christology. That's what the Sixth Council is about. It's dogmatized. So Rome rejects the essence-energy distinction. I wish we had gone there with Nick, but he didn't want to go there because, I think he knew that was a territory where he would have no argument. So he stuck to the papal stuff, but that's okay because the papal stuff is still an argument on our side. So Nick didn't get the essence energy stuff, which is where I wanted to go. Nick didn't get the arguments that show that just because a pope claims something or this or that doesn't matter, because all I have to do to knock down the whole papal house of cards is to give 1, 2, 3 examples where it's not true. So Pope St. Gregory the Great shows it's not true in his letters about the universal supremacy being Antichrist. The Sixth Council shows it's not true because the church had the mindset that there was absolutely nothing wrong with condemning Pope Honorius at an ecumenical council. Pope John VIII signed the Eighth Eastern Council's forbidding of the filioque. All the Catholic historians and apologists admit it, and they're at pains to explain it. Peter is not a person who has universal temporal supremacy, and Roman Catholic dogma claims that he does in Unum Sanctum. And it's always been propped up by fake decretals, the pseudo-Isidorian decretals, the donation of Constantine. The Vatican admits these are all fake. So, I mean, those are like rocks. I mean, we can keep going. We can go. And all of those quotes, by the way, it's most of the time in the context, it's if you have an appeal from an east to the west, it's because the eastern guy didn't have a lot of people who would support him. He was probably surrounded by heretics, right? Athanasius, surrounded by heretics. He could talk to a guy across the empire in Rome who was Orthodox. I mean, once you understand that Orthodox theology hails all of these Orthodox popes, like half of those arguments that Nick was trying to throw at me, they don't have any weight at all. Yeah, we know that we don't think that all popes are heretics. That's crazy. So, I mean, the official schism is, it's a little, actually, it starts kind of prior to 1054, and that's because Rome dogmatized eventually Toledo. So we don't officially split at Toledo because Toledo wasn't necessarily universally known. But eventually in time, it becomes official Roman Catholic dogma, and if you read Denzinger, you can see that they cite Toledo and the stupid psychological analogies from Augustine to prove the filioque. So anyway, so all of that stuff Nick was not able to deal with any of that. We couldn't go into any of that stuff in any depth, and I do appreciate Nick hanging in and being there and doing the discussion, because it made for a great question and answer period and dialogue. But for those who are interested, and we're going to go into this book in the subscribers section after this, I recommend the easy readable Church Papacy Schism by Dr. Philip Sherrard. And Sherrard, I'm not recommending everything that he writes. I do not recommend Lineaments of a Sacred Tradition. He got liberal apparently towards latter days. However, this book is really good. It's solid. Greek East and Latin West is solid. Those are two good books. Again, I would not read Lineaments of a Sacred Tradition. He got a little too into perennial philosophy there. However, these books are good. And the reason that I really like Sherrard's Church Papacy Schism is because he focuses on how the theology is what led to the error of the papacy. And one of the commenters made the great point that that no Roman Catholics understand that the reason they have a hard time accepting that the Orthodox Church in every local instantiation or incarnation has the fullness of Catholicity. Because you can't get higher than a bishop, the fullness of the church is right there. And that's what Ignatius says in his epistles about the bishop having the fullness of Catholicity, right? And what that means is that because the fullness of Catholicity is local, it's explained by the giving of the Holy Spirit. Pentecost shows that we have the fullness of the Spirit in the local bishopric. And then that bishopric obviously being united to the church and all the other nations, right? Jesus said, convert the nations. He didn't say destroy the nations and wipe them out into a new Babel. That's not what Pentecost means. He says, convert them, baptize the ethnos, right? In the Great Commission. So what church papacy and schism does is that it will actually show, first of all, that the fullness of Catholicity exists at the local level, right? So you're not like a gradation lower on the chain of being in a local Novus Ordo church compared to the spiritual supremacy of the great mega super essence church over in Rome. There's none of that, because the Patriarch of Constantinople is just a bishop. He has a level of honor that was accorded to him back in the days of the ecumenical councils. But that's it. As with all of the other pentarchies. And obviously in the praxis of Orthodoxy, again, mirroring what's obviously in the councils, the Patriarchate of Moscow has a higher level supremacy than arguably these others, because the continuance of the temporal power was in Russia, obviously. And again, if the church already confirmed this model, the double-headed eagle, after the fall of Constantinople, where was the temporal authority? Russia, obviously. It's not hard. Why do you think the West wanted to get rid of the Romanovs? Anyway, so church papacy schism will follow the argumentation of how the errors in the theology of God and the loss of the essence energy distinction, the loss of uncreated grace. This is crucial. Listen to me. The loss of uncreated grace, the essence energy distinction. You can't have uncreated grace without the essence energy distinction. Get that through your head. That leads to the rise and need for the papal office. The juridical body is distinguished from the sacramental sacerdotal body. And that's distinguished from the Eucharistic body. This becomes normative in Roman Catholic Western scholastics. Eastern Orthodoxy has none of that, and that's why we don't ban kids from communion. That's why we do paedo communion, dude. But these gradations and these distinctions of bodies, that's what leads to not just the banning of children from communion, but the idea of these levels of Christianity. And that's why Orthodoxy doesn't have any of that. There is the authority and the role of the bishop and the priests, the presbyters. But the bishop is not any super Christian over against a monastic. The monastic is not a super Christian over against a married person. This is why clerical celibacy becomes this bizarre obsession in Latin Christianity. And it's part of the reason why there's such a sexual problem. But that's a different topic. We don't have to go into all that. The theology leads to the bad ecclesiology, right? And so filioque leads to papacy, right? Who's going to govern the church? What are we going to do? How are we going to know right and wrong? Give us a guy. No, you have the Holy Spirit. You say, well, that's Protestant. It's not Protestant, because I just told you this is the way the church operated for the first millennium. So then Sherrard will move into discussing more specifically how the filioque leads to this, and how the imbalance in the Trinity is what leads to an imbalance in the church on earth, right? If the church is the icon of the Trinity, then there's a balance in the one and the many. The Father might have a primacy in terms of order, or the ordo theologiae, the order of theology, but he doesn't have more godhood or more essence than the Son or the Spirit. So there's a balance in the one and the many in the Trinity. There's a balance in the one and the many in the church, the icon of God. So that is the two distinct paths here that we want to tread and trace out. And what I'm going to do in the next talk for the subscribers is do a little bit more discussion from this book. But I want to contrast it with where, again, Western thought went. Western thought didn't just stop with papacy and now it becomes like a thing of where we got to have the papacy or we're going to be modernists. It actually leads into a lot of other bad places, and that will be the Frankfurt School, which we've discussed many, many times. But I've not yet seen anybody actually go through a book from a guy from the Frankfurt School. We will do that. We are going to go through the totality in the next hour, just as a selection, because actually this guy has had interactions with popes. I think there's a debate between Habermas and Ratzinger at one time. We're not going to go into that stupid debate, but we are going to talk about theory and practice from Jürgen Habermas, one of the Frankfurt School luminaries. And what we're going to see is dialectics. And the reason we're going to talk about dialectics from Habermas is that I'm going to argue to you that the papacy and Protestantism and grace versus works and faith versus grace and this versus that versus Pope versus Emperor, these dialectics are what we avoid. Now, I'm not saying that Orthodox are perfect in doing this. I'm just saying that we want to avoid dialectics. And I'm arguing that since Plato and the adoption of the simplicity doctrine in the West and the Origenistic problematic, the West has become obsessed with dialectics because of Plato. That's what I'm saying. And then this goes into Jewish thought, and it goes into Marxism, and it goes into the Frankfurt School. And I'm going to show you how dialectics is the result of all this. When you mess up your theology, you end up with a bunch of crazy dialectics. And you get the anarchist versus the collectivist. And you get the one versus the many. And we want to avoid all that. And that's what we're going to talk about as we analyze Theory and Praxis by Jürgen Habermas. We're going to have a Haber Black Moss. So anyway, this is Jay Dyer from Jay's Analysis. This has been my reflections on the debate with Nick. And in the second hour, if you want to hear that for subscribers, you can go to Jay's Analysis and subscribe for $4.95 a month or $60 a year, however you want to do it. And you get full access to the archives, lectures, talks, podcasts, interviews, many archives there, many hours. Get yourself a grad PhD level education on all these topics in my archives. If you're interested, we're going to go into some actual Frankfurt School dudes. Thank you for watching. Also, you can buy my book, signed copies, Esoteric Hollywood, at Jay's Analysis at the tab. And you can watch my show, Hollywood Decoded, with Jay Widener at Gaia TV. Thank you.